Hello everyone, this is your instructor in income taxation. Still, our topic for today is fundamental principles of taxation. This is the third part of fundamental principles of taxation. In this video, I'm going to discuss the limitations of the power of taxation. The power of taxation is comprehensive, unlimited, plenary, and supreme. Diniscuss ko yan sa scope of the power of taxation. However, ang power of taxation ay hindi absolute. Hindi siya absolute kasi meron siyang limitations. At yung limitations na yon ay yung inherent limitations at constitutional limitations. Unahin natin yung inherent limitations. When we say inherent limitations, these are the limitations which exist despite the absence of an express constitutional provision. Meaning to say, itong inherent limitations, ito yung limitations na kung saan hindi na kailangan pang ilagay sa Constitution. There are 5 inherent limitations and they are provided below. So, I will be discussing each of these limitations. The first inherent limitation is territoriality of taxation. Tax laws cannot operate beyond a state's territorial limits. Property outside one's jurisdiction does not receive any protection from the state. So, hindi na kailangan pang ilagay sa Constitution na ang Philippine government, ang pwede lang niyang patawan ng tax ay yung nasasakupan niya. Ang sabi dito, tax laws cannot operate beyond a state's territorial limits. So bakit? The Philippine government provides public services only within the boundaries of the Philippines. And since it provides public services only within the Philippines, then taxes can only be imposed within the territories of the Philippines. The Philippine government cannot impose taxes on foreign subjects since these foreign subjects do not get benefits from our government. So, property outside one's jurisdiction does not receive any protection from the state. Kapag sinabing jurisdiction, ang ibig sabihin niyan, nasasakupan. So, there's no basis of imposing tax on this property outside the Philippine territories because this property doesn't get protection from the Philippine government. That is the meaning of territoriality of taxation. Next, the second inherent limitation is international comity. When we say international comity, this pertains to mutual courtesy or reciprocity between states. In other words, this pertains to the polite and friendly agreement or agreements among nations. It is a basic principle of international law that all states are equally sovereign. Each state observes co-equal sovereignty by not taxing the properties, income, or effects of the fellow states. For example, embassies or consular offices of foreign governments in the Philippines, including international organizations and their non-Filipino staff, are not subject to Philippine taxation. Let's say, yung US Embassy dito sa Pilipinas. Yung US Embassy dito sa Pilipinas ay hindi pinapatawan ng tax dito sa Pilipinas because of mutual courtesy between the Philippines and the US. Under the National Internal Revenue Code or NIRC, the income of foreign government and foreign government-owned and controlled corporations are not subject to income tax. So, hindi pinapatawan ng tax dito sa Pilipinas yung foreign government and foreign government-owned and controlled corporations. When a state enters into treaties with other states, it is bound to honor the agreements as a matter of mutual courtesy. So there are instances na kung saan ang mga bansa nag-enter sila into an agreement. Ang tawag doon ay international treaty. So bilang respeto, kailangang sundin ng mga bansa na involved yung international treaty. In case the states' treaty agreements with other states conflict with its local tax law, its treaty agreements are given primacy. In other words, susundin nila yung international treaty kaysa sa kanilang sariling tax law. If merong conflict between the local tax law and international treaty. That is the second inherent limitation, which is international comity. Next, the third inherent limitation is public purpose. This one is synonymous to governmental purpose. A tax must always be imposed for a public purpose, otherwise it will be declared as invalid. So no tax law may be enacted for the purpose of raising revenue for private purposes. Ang taxation, intended yan for common good. Ang taxation, intended siya for public purpose at hindi for private purpose. So, if tax is imposed and collected for private purpose, then that is invalid. Hindi siya valid. So, hindi pinapataw at kinokolekta yung tax for private interest. Diba? Yung sabi ko, yung purpose ng taxation ay dapat public purpose, hindi private purpose. So, dapat ma-determine kung yung purpose ba ay public or private. Ang tanong, sino ang may kapangyarihan o karapatan na mag-determine kung yung purpose ba ay public or private? Of course, yung Congress. It is the Congress which has the power to determine whether the purpose is public or private. Next, the fourth inherent limitation is exemption of the government. The government normally does not tax itself, as this will not raise additional funds but will only impute additional costs. So, hindi pinapatawan ng tax ang gobyerno kasi gagastos lang ang gobyerno kung itatax niya pa ang kanyang sarili. At saka common sense, ang gobyerno ang nangongolekta ng tax. So, dapat hindi niya pinapatawan ng tax ang kanyang sarili. Under the NIRC or the National Internal Revenue Code, governmental properties and income from essential public functions are not subject to taxation. However, income of the government from its properties and activities conducted for profit, including income from government-owned and controlled corporations, is subject to tax. So, tignan nyo muna kung yung government entity, agency, at instrumentality ay nagpo-perform ng essential public function o nagpo-perform ng proprietary function. Kung yung government entity, agency, at instrumentality ay nagpo-perform ng essential public function at hindi for profit, then yung property at income ng government entity, agency, at instrumentality na yon ay hindi papatawan ng tax. Pero kung yung government entity, agency, at instrumentality ay nagpo-perform ng proprietary function, meaning to say mainly for profit, then yung income ng government entity, agency, at instrumentality na yon ay taxable. That is the fourth inherent limitation, and that is exemption of the government. Next, the fifth inherent limitation is non-delegation of the taxing power. So what cannot be delegated is the legislative enactment or imposition or levying of tax measure. Recall that levying a tax is a legislative function. Diniscuss ko yan sa aspects of taxation. So yung pag-enact o paggawa ng tax laws, pag-impose ng tax o pag-levy ng tax, yan ay kapangyarihan ng Legislative Department. Yan ay kapangyarihan ng Congress. Yung power ng Legislative Department na gumawa ng tax laws, mag-impose ng tax o mag-levy ng tax, yan ay hindi pwedeng i-delegate or ilipat as a general rule. Pero merong exceptions. Kung merong general rule, of course, merong exceptions to the rule. First, local government units or LGUs are allowed to exercise the power to tax to enable them to exercise their fiscal autonomy. Second, the President is empowered to fix the amount of tariffs to be flexible to trade conditions. And third, other cases that require expedient and effective administration and implementation of assessment and collection of taxes. So these are the exceptions to the non-delegation of the taxing power. Let's now proceed to the constitutional limitations. When we say constitutional limitations, as the term implies, these are the limitations that are provided in the Constitution. So ito yung mga limitations na nakasaad sa Constitution. There are 16 constitutional limitations and they are provided below. So I will be discussing each of these constitutional limitations. The first constitutional limitation is the due process of law. Ang sabi sa Bill of Rights ng Constitution, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. So, walang sinuman ang mawawalan ng buhay, kalayaan at pag-aari nang hindi dumadaan sa tamang proseso ng batas. So, it follows na dapat yung tax laws na ginagawa ng Congress ay hindi harsh or oppressive. When we say due process of law, may dalawang aspects yan. Yung una ay tinatawag na substantive due process at yung pangalawa ay tinatawag na procedural due process. In substantive due process, tax must be imposed only for public purpose, collected only under authority of valid law, and only by the taxing power having jurisdiction. Dito sa substantive due process, ang tax ay dapat ipataw for public purpose. Because if the purpose is a private purpose, then that is invalid. Aside from that, the tax must be collected only under authority of valid law and only by the taxing power having jurisdiction. Meaning to say, hindi ka basta-basta kokolektahan na lang ng tax kung walang valid law na nagsasabing dapat kang kolektahan ng taxes. And of course, dapat magkolekta lang ng tax ang taxing authority sa kanyang nasasakupan. Therefore, an assessment without a legal basis violates the requirement of due process. On the other hand, in procedural due process, there should be no arbitrariness in assessment and collection of taxes, and the government shall observe the taxpayer's right to notice and hearing. So dapat makatwiran yung pag-assess at pag-collect ng taxes at irespeto ng gobyerno yung right of taxpayer to be heard. Kaya siya tinawag na procedural due process kasi nga dadaan sa iba't ibang procedures bago ma-assess at makollect yung taxes. That is procedural due process. Next, equal protection of the law. All persons subject to legislation shall be treated alike under similar circumstances and conditions, both in the privilege conferred and liabilities imposed. So, ang ibig sabihin nito, dapat ang taxpayers pantay-pantay sila ng rights and obligations. Taxpayers should be treated alike in terms of rights and obligations, or the taxpayers should be treated equally in terms of rights and obligations. This rule applies where taxpayers are under the same circumstances and conditions. So itong equal protection of the law, applicable yan kapag nasa parehong circumstances at conditions ang taxpayers. For example, yung Congress, hindi niya pwedeng hindi patawan ng tax yung nagtitinda ng balot kung pinapatawan niya naman ng tax yung nagtitinda ng penoy. Kasi nga, yung balot at penoy, they are essentially the same goods. Yan yung sinasabing equal protection of the law. Next, uniformity rule in taxation. The rule of taxation shall be uniform and equitable. Kung yung isang taxpayer pinatawan ng tax, dapat patawan din yung other taxpayer if they are under similar circumstances and conditions. Kung yung isang taxpayer ay exempt sa tax, dapat exempt din yung isang taxpayer if they are under similar circumstances and conditions. Taxpayers under the similar circumstances should not be taxed the same. Kasi nga, magkaiba sila na circumstances. Taxpayers falling under the same class are taxed the same kasi nga, they belong to the same class. Yan ang ibig sabihin ng rule of uniformity in taxation. Next, progressive system of taxation. Kapag sinabing progressive, ang ibig sabihin niyan ay increasing, pataas ng pataas. So, under the progressive system of taxation, tax rates increase as the tax base increases. Yung tax rates, of course, yan yung mga percentage. Yung tax base naman, dyan minumultiply yung tax rates para malaman yung amount of tax na babayaran ng taxpayer. For example, kung pataas ng pataas yung taxable income ng taxpayer, then pataas din ng pataas yung babayaran niyang tax. The Constitution favors progressive tax as it is consistent with the taxpayer's ability to pay. For example, yung isang taxpayer, may malaki siyang income. Since malaki ang kanyang income, mas kaya niyang magbayad ng taxes. Therefore, mas malaki ang babayaran niyang tax compared sa mga taxpayers who have less income. That is progressive system of taxation. Next, non-imprisonment for non-payment of debt or poll tax. As a policy, no one shall be imprisoned because of his or her poverty, and no one shall be imprisoned for mere inability to pay debt. In other words, as a policy, hindi ka makukulong kung hindi ka nakapagbayad ng utang, pero dapat inacquire mo yung debt in good faith. Sir, what if inacquire yung debt in bad faith? Kapag inacquire yung debt in bad faith, then that is estafa, which is a criminal offense punishable by imprisonment. Again, if you acquire the debt in good faith, you will not be imprisoned. Hindi ka makukulong. But if you acquire the debt in bad faith, that is already a crime, so pwede kang makulong. The non-payment of tax is similar to a crime. So kapag hindi ka nagbayad ng tax, krimen yan. At dahil krimen yan, pwede kang makulong. Pero meron tayong exception. At yung exception na yon ay poll tax. That means, hindi ka makukulong kapag hindi ka nagbayad ng poll tax. When we say poll tax, it is a tax of fixed amount imposed on residents within a specific territory regardless of citizenship, business, or profession. In short, yan yung personal tax or community tax or residency tax, or yan din yung sinasabi natin na cedula. So, if I'm living from a town in Pangasinan, my poll tax or personal tax or community tax or residency tax or cedula should come from my town in Pangasinan. Poll tax has two components. The first component is basic community tax, and the second component is the additional community tax. The constitutional guarantee of non-imprisonment for non-payment of poll tax applies only to the basic community tax. Non-payment of the additional community tax is an act of tax evasion punishable by imprisonment. So, anong ibig sabihin yan? Ang ibig sabihin yan, hindi ka makukulong kapag hindi ka nagbayad ng basic community tax. Pero pwede kang makulong kapag hindi ka nagbayad ng additional community tax. That is non-imprisonment for non-payment of debt or poll tax. Next, non-impairment of obligation and contract. The state should set an example of good faith among its constituents. It should not set aside its obligations from contracts by the exercise of its taxation power. So what does it mean? May mga pagkakataon na ikaw ay may transaction sa gobyerno. Therefore, sila ay may utang sa iyo. Meron kayong kontrata at meron siyang obligation sa iyo. So, hindi pwedeng sabihin ng gobyerno na hindi ka na niya babayaran kasi nga meron ka rin namang babayaran na tax sa gobyerno. Hindi niya pwedeng gawin yon kahit na siya ang nangongolekta ng taxes. Moreover, tax exemptions granted under contract should be honored and should not be canceled by a unilateral government action. Yung tax exemptions, ibig sabihin yan, exempted ka na magbayad ng tax. So, if there is a contract that says you are exempted to pay tax, then that should be honored and respected by the government. That is non-impairment of obligation and contract. Next, free worship rule. The Philippine government adopts free exercise of religion and does not subject its exercise of taxation. Consequently, the properties and revenues of religious institutions such as tithes and offerings are not subject to tax. Meaning to say, yung mga collections and properties ng religious institutions, including tithes and offerings, hindi sila pinapatawan ng tax. However, this exemption does not extend to income from properties or activities of religious institutions that are proprietary or commercial in nature. So kapag yung activity ng religious institution ay mainly for profit, yung income na madederive ng religious institution sa activity na yon ay taxable. That is free worship rule. Next, exemption of religious, charitable, or educational entities, non-profit cemeteries, churches, and mosques, lands, buildings, and improvements from property taxes. The constitutional exemption from property tax applies on properties actually directly and exclusively used for charitable, religious, and educational purposes. Sinabi din sa Constitution na hindi na kailangang magbayad ng property tax yung mga nabanggit. Religious, charitable, or educational entities, non-profit cemeteries, churches, and mosques, lands, buildings, and improvements. They are not subject to property taxes. Meaning to say, yung taxes doon sa lupa nila. That is provided in the Constitution. In observing the constitutional limitation, the Philippines follows the doctrine of use wherein only properties actually devoted for religious, charitable, or educational activities are exempt from real property tax. So yung properties lang na devoted for religious, charitable, or educational activities yung hindi pinapatawan ng real property tax. Of course, yung mga properties na hindi devoted for religious, charitable, or educational activities ay pinapatawan ng real property tax. Next, non-appropriation of public funds or property for the benefit of any church, sect, or system of religion. This constitutional limitation is intended to highlight the separation of religion and the state. To support freedom of religion, the government should not favor any particular system of religion by appropriating public funds or property in support thereof. So, sinasabi dito na kapag nakakolekta ng tax ang gobyerno, hindi pwede na paboran niya yung isang system of religion, yung isang sekto, o yung isang simbahan. Kasi nga, ang tax ay for public purpose. So, hindi porke yun yung religion ng president ay papaboran niya yon. Hindi pwedeng i-appropriate yung public funds or public property in favor of any church, sect, or system of religion. Take note that compensation to priests, imams, or religious ministers working with the military, penal institutions, orphanage, or leprosarium is not considered religious appropriation. So, hindi porke nakakatanggap ng compensation or sahod ang mga tao na to, ay pinapaboran na yung isang simbahan, sekto, or system of religion. That is non-appropriation of public funds or property for the benefit of any church, sect, or system of religion. Next, exemption from taxes of the revenues and assets of non-profit, non-stock educational institutions, including grants, endowments, donations, or contributions for educational purposes. The Constitution recognizes the necessity of education in state building by granting tax exemption on revenues and assets of non-profit educational institutions. However, this exemption applies only on revenues and assets that are actually, directly, and exclusively devoted for educational purposes. So, naniniwala ang gobyerno na kailangan ng education at educational institutions for nation building. Ang education ay necessity. That is a necessity. That's why yung revenues and assets ng non-profit, non-stock educational institutions ay hindi pinapatawan ng tax. Take note, applicable lang ito sa revenues and assets na devoted for educational purposes. That is exemption from taxes of the revenues and assets of non-profit, non-stock educational institutions, including grants, endowments, donations, or contributions for educational purposes. Next, concurrence of a majority of all members of Congress for the passage of a law granting tax exemption. As a safety net, the Constitution requires the vote of the majority of all members of Congress in the grant of tax exemption. Kung sakaling magpapasa ng batas ang Congress na mag-grant ng tax exemption, kinakailangan na majority of all members of the Congress ang pumayag doon. In the approval of an exemption law, an absolute majority or the majority of all members of Congress is required. Meaning to say, for example, kung isang daan yung miyembro ng Congress, 100 din dapat yung pumayag para ma-approve yung tax exemption law. Yun yung sinasabing absolute majority. However, in the withdrawal of tax exemption, only a relative majority or quorum majority is required. Kapag babawiin na yung tax exemption law, ang kailangan lang ay relative majority or quorum majority. Ang ibig sabihin ng relative majority or quorum majority ay 50% plus 1. So kung ang miyembro ng Congress ay 100, for example, dapat 51 members ang pumayag para ma-withdraw yung tax exemption law. Ang 50% ng 100 ay 15. 50 plus 1, that is equal to 51. Kaya 51 members ang kailangan para ma-withdraw yung tax exemption law. That is concurrence of a majority of all members of Congress for the passage of a law granting tax exemption. Next, non-diversification of tax collections. Tax collections should be used only for public purpose. It should never be diversified or used for private purpose. Actually, itong non-diversification of tax collections ay related sa public purpose. Hindi pwedeng ilihis o i-diversify yung tax collection sa private purpose. Recall that the collection of tax is only for public purpose. If it is for private purpose, then it is invalid. That is non-diversification of tax collections. Next, non-delegation of the power of taxation. This is related sa inherent limitation na non-delegation of the taxing power. The taxation power is vested exclusively in Congress. So generally, hindi pwedeng ilipat or i-delegate yung kapangyarihan ng Kongreso na mag-tax sa ibang bahagi ng gobyerno. However, delegation of the power of taxation may be made on matters involving the expedient and effective administration and implementation of assessment and collection of taxes. So, pwedeng i-delegate yung power of taxation kung mas mapapadali yung pag-assess at pag-collect ng taxes. Implementing administrative agencies such as Department of Finance and BIR issue revenue regulations, rulings, orders, or circulars to interpret and classify the application of the law. But even so, their functions are merely intended to interpret or clarify the proper application of the law. So kung meron mang kayang gawin ang implementing administrative agencies gaya ng Department of Finance at BIR, yun yung gumawa ng revenue regulations, mga implementing guidelines, mga Implementing Rules and Regulations or IIR. Ang ibig kong sabihin, kung ano yung tax, kung alin ang itatax, power yon ng Congress. Pero kung yung proseso, yung detalye, yung step-by-step process, yun na nga yung mga revenue regulations, implementing rules and regulations, or IRR, ay pwede namang gawin yon. Pero hindi ibig sabihin na ililipat yung power to tax ng Congress. That is non-delegation of the power of taxation. Next, non-impairment of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to review tax cases. Notwithstanding the existence of the Court of Tax Appeals, which is a special court, all cases involving taxes can be raised to and be finally decided by the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Ang Supreme Court ang pinakamataas na hukuman dito sa Pilipinas. So kung sakaling hindi ka pa satisfied or tingin mo na unjust yung decision ng korte, pwede mong itaas ng itaas yan until sa Supreme Court. Pero kapag dumating ka na sa Supreme Court at meron ng decision yung Supreme Court, therefore, yun na yung dulo. That is already the end. So, hindi pwedeng agawin yung jurisdiction ng Supreme Court na mag-review ng tax cases notwithstanding the existence of the Court of Tax Appeals. For example, may isang kumpanya na natalo sa Court of Tax Appeals. So itong kumpanya na to, pwede niya pang dalhin o iangat yung case na yan sa Supreme Court. That is non-impairment of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court to review tax cases. Next, the requirement that appropriations, revenue, or tariff bills shall originate exclusively in the House of Representatives. Appropriations, revenue, or tariff bills shall originate exclusively in the House of Representatives, but the Senate may propose or concur with amendments. Ang ibig sabihin nito, yung appropriations, revenue, or tariff bills ay dapat manggaling sa House of Representatives. Ang gagawa ng mga bills na yan ay yung mga miyembro ng House of Representatives. Meaning to say, yung mga congressman. So bakit yung House of Representatives ang dapat gumawa ng mga bills na yan? Kasi sila yung mga binoto sa mga distrito sa probinsya. Di ba sa probinsya, merong District 1, merong District 2, merong District 3, and so on. At dahil sila yung mga binoto sa mga distrito, sila yung pinakasensitibo sa pangangailangan at problema sa mga distrito. That's why those bills should originate from the House of Representatives. Yung bills na nanggaling sa House of Representatives, ipapasa yan sa Senate. At yung Senate, pwede nilang i-amend yung bills kasi nga yung Senate, meron silang kapangyarihan na mag-propose ng amendments. That is the requirement that appropriations, revenue, or tariff bills shall originate exclusively in the House of Representatives. Next, the delegation of the taxing power to local government units. Each local government unit shall exercise the power to create its own sources of revenue and shall have a just share in the national taxes. Diba? Generally, hindi pwedeng i-delegate yung power ng Congress na mag-impose ng tax. However, sabi sa Constitution, pwede namang mag-impose ng tax ang LGUs or local government units. That's why merong tinatawag na local taxes. Pwedeng mag-impose yung LGU ng local taxes sa kanyang nasasakupan. However, The power of local government units to impose taxes is always subject to the limitations which Congress may provide, the former having no inherent power to tax. So kahit na may kapangyarihan ang LGU na mag-impose ng local taxes, it is always subject to the limitations provided by Congress. Kasi nga, yung power ng LGU ay delegated power lang. Yung power ng LGU ay delegated power lang. Pero yung power ng Congress ay inherent power. That's why the power of the local government units is always subject to the limitations provided by the Congress.